As Bill knows, because he's covered much of what I'm going to be covering today many times, this presentation can take 5 minutes or it can take 50 minutes, depending on how much detail we want to go into. So I'm going to sort of blast through things and probably omit some of the things that are on my script.
Sorry about that.
No, it's, this is infinitely flexible, and there's lots, basically, I'm pointing you to all sorts of other resources, so I don't really need to talk through everything in great detail. But just quickly, accessibility is an appropriate portion of this discussion. As Evan said when we first met to talk about this, accessibility is a huge boundary to cross, and we're a long way from crossing it. The good news is that most people in this room are probably closer to crossing it than people are in other sectors of the industry, the trade sector and professional publishing or textbook publishing, which suffers from a real dearth of acronyms relative to what goes on in the SSP. So you have highly structured content. It needs to be HTML5 based and packaged as EPUB in order to be really optimally accessible, but you're a long way towards getting there with very sophisticated structured content. But what I want to talk to you today about are the tools and resources that are actually available that people in the trade and educational world are availing themselves up and which we want to make sure that you're aware of. All these initiatives, as Bill cited, are really happening thanks to an incredible degree of collaboration among all the organizations that we've been talking about. The IDPF, the W3C, the BISG, the AAP, companies like mine, Benetech, who are collaborating on standards, both formal and informal, around informal standards around best practices, guidelines, and tools. Just quick context on where I'm coming from with Benetech and what our role is in this space. We're a technology nonprofit in Palo Alto. Our mission is to provide software solutions to underserved social causes, such as human rights, the environment, and global literacy. Our flagship initiative is Bookshare. We're the largest library of accessible digital books in the world. We have 400,000 members who are certified as having a print disability, blindness, low vision, mobility impairments, severe dyslexia primarily, actually, in 50 countries around the world. We have a unique vantage point at Benetech on where publishers are with accessibility because we work with over 800 publishers, some of whom are in this room, who actually donate their digital files to our service. No money changes hands. We transform their files into accessible files and make them available through our website. We have 400,000 books in our collection. It's growing at a rate of about 5,000 books a month, thanks to publishers. We largely serve a trade publishing audience and an educational publishing audience, but we have 32 university presses we're working with and academic and professional publishers, Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and the list goes on. So we see everything. 5,000 files coming in every month. We see the good, the bad, the ugly. We know what people are doing right, what they're not doing right, how they're screwing up the Onyx, how they're dealing with metadata. It's a unique perspective. We see what the disability student services offices are dealing with at universities who have to try and compensate, retrofit content to make it accessible for their students. It's an ugly world to observe. We interface with them all the time. And at Benetech, our mantra is all content that's born digital should be born accessible. We coined the phrase and we harp on it repeatedly. A big part of our mission is to help publishers achieve that goal so that we can do better things than by sort of replicating the world's digital library with a parallel library of accessible books, which is really what we do. If you guys can do it right from the get-go, we don't have to do it. We can do other things which Benetech is committed to doing. I'm going to walk you quickly through the BISG Quick Start Guide to Accessible Publishing, which, as Bill said, I chaired the committee that produced this document under Bill's leadership. The hope was to, well, just so you know, well, this is probably the most downloaded publication the BISG has ever produced. It's getting incredible traction. It's available in French, Spanish, German, Italian, and Korean, thanks to VitalSource, who did the translations for us. So this is a 77-page document, and you might wonder where the quick is in a 77-page document. But the quick is contained in the first 20 pages. These first 20 pages are a non-technical overview of what in the world accessibility is to get everybody in your organization up to speed on what the issues are, what the opportunities are. Whether it's executive management, production teams, digital staff, editorial and marketing, legal, this guide offers them a fundamental understanding of what accessibility is all about and what their role is. And Bill has emphasized this, and we stress that everybody has a role. This is not something that gets walled off into in a digital production corner of your operation that no one else has to think about. Everybody has to think about it. It needs to be part of the culture. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the table of contents this didn't display in quite the same fashion that it does when Bill does it, where the table of contents is neatly on the left, and we don't have to do this scrolling nonsense. But anyway, I'll just show you the table of contents here and quickly let you know what this guide contains. There's an executive summary which talks about what are the fundamental issues around accessibility, why is it important? A lot of people really still don't have a clue. Accessible content creates value. We want to make sure people understand that an accessible book is a more valuable book. It's not something that you have to do because the government is beating you up about it or consumers are refusing to purchase your book unless it's accessible. It really does increase the value of your books. One of the most valuable parts of this document is how to create accessible content. This consists of 17 tips which lay out in little bulleted quick paragraphs what you actually have to do in order to achieve an accessible publication. It's a cheat sheet that evolved out of a 9-tip document that we did a couple of years ago, and it's morphed into 17 tips, but it is still, I think, one of the most downloaded documents in the general trade industry in particular, because it really gives you a snapshot of what you have to deal with. If we were to go through the tips, which I'm not going to do because I'd have to move the cursor and then I'd never get back to the table of contents. If I had that neat little directory on the left-hand column, I could do that.
Use radio.
Well, yeah, we didn't have time to download it, yeah. Anyway, that's for another presentation that I'll be doing next week. Use HTML5 if you're creating EPUBs, you're doing it already. Use HTML5 headings, tags, structural semantics, et cetera, navigation. I won't go through the tips in the interest of time, but they're really a valuable resource, I think, for everybody. There's a section here that you'll see down below, if you can read this fine print, about developing a baseline for accessibility. That's a critical component that I want to squeeze in the next few minutes. Interestingly enough, we have an overview on all the legal requirements that addresses legal requirements in the US and internationally. So the section, again, initially is, we're now up to overview of legal requirements, page 21. Here the fun starts on page 22 with all the appendices and resources, and there is a huge section on the legal requirements internationally. A glossary of terms for everybody who, can't, is not versed in this, and detailed information about the baseline, which is what I'm going to address next. So this business of a baseline, which you may hear more and more about, is something that's coming out of a Google Impact Challenge Award that was just awarded to the DAISY Consortium to essentially develop guidelines and, critically, certification so that publishers could actually objectively certify their material as accessible. DAISY's going to be spending the next year and a half building this certification. And we at Benetech are going to be fast-tracking this by developing a pilot, sort of a streamlined certification process. And we're in an alpha stage now. We're working with 2 partners. We're actually going to be trying to get real-world feedback from publishers about our assessment of their files, which is going to be a certification assessment. We'll get feedback from them, we'll feed it back to Daisy, and by the end of the year, we should have a formal certification process, not completely automated, hopefully largely automated, some human intervention required, that publishers can take hold of as some kind of scaffolding as they try to navigate the crazy waters of what does it mean to have an accessible publication? Where's the bar? What do you have to do to meet the bar? So the baseline is a huge initiative. I think George said that there were over 1,000 applications for the Google Impact Challenge Award, and Google said the number of companies wanting to contribute game-changing ideas around accessibility were formidable. Daisy won the challenge, and so we'll be partnering with them to really see if we can't change the face of accessibility and turn it into something that people can look at, not as sort of an amorphous, what do I do, but as a standard with steps that you can take to fulfill the obligations, the minimum obligations that that standard is going to impose. Let's see, I'm not going to go through the baseline and some of the details, but discoverability, metadata, in addition to the idea of evaluating files for their conformance to accessibility is critical. So we're working closely to get more properties introduced into schema.org so that websites will expose content that has been built accessibly. The education field obviously is looking at this whole idea of certification very seriously. They're really begging for it because in many cases textbook adoptions are now being subjected to extremely close audits, where if their content isn't accessible, the state of Texas will not adopt their textbook. So a lot of the pressure around accessibility is coming from the textbook industry in particular. The trade folks have it pretty easy with primarily all textbooks that are fairly easy to make accessible, but the education space and the textbook adoption space is where the rubber's hitting the road right now and where the pressure is really felt. Just a quick note about Benetech and what we do. We have an R&D center called Diagram, where we try to make it easier, faster, and cheaper to make images and graphics accessible. And we create open source tools to give away to publishers so that they can embed them in their workflow and hopefully create content that is accessible from the get-go. We have a tool that compensates for the limitations of browsers to display MathML. It's a tool called MathML Cloud. We developed under funding from Microsoft. We have an image description tool that allows you to retrofit an existing digital file with image descriptions. It's also a training tool on how to train people. How do you describe a complex image? A raft of about 180 image types. That's being used by Pearson and Wiley now to train their staffs on how to describe images. We've worked with the Gates Foundation to introduce the first 4 accessibility properties into schema.org. So that's kind of it. There are tools that have been referred to, EPUB test, which has been modified to incorporate accessibility rankings to enable people to see how content renders on different reading systems. VitalSource is the first entity to achieve 100% accessibility ranking across all reading systems. There's going to be a website called inclusivepublishing.org, which is going to be sort of a master reference for all things. These are initiatives that are falling under the Daisy Google Award. So I think that's it in a nutshell. I'd like to leave a little time for questions.
Well done, Robin.
Thank you. Thank you. Bill can do it. I can do it.
We do actually have a couple of minutes for questions. I think Robin cut her presentation down quite a bit, so apologize for that, Robin.
Happy to spare you all the gory details.
Yeah. So, questions for any of the speakers?
Robin, you mentioned, obviously, this is the BISG Quick Start Guide, and BISG says books to me. Are you also in the journal space?
Not yet, really. It's just too formidable a realm to tackle at this point. But I hope I have a different answer to that question a year from now.
One of the reasons we wanted this segment in this session is to just get this on your radar, because as my comment at the beginning that the scholarly sector is really far ahead of almost all of the sectors technically, that's the one area where we fall down, is that those PDFs are not accessible. And HTML is accessible. So those of you that are actually putting full text HTML out are inches away from having good accessible content. But so much is still distributed as PDF. But what's ironic is that your infrastructure, our infrastructure, I should say, is built for all that semantic detail that accessibility needs, and that's what Evan was talking about. That's what JATS gives you. JATS is one of the richest markup schemes for content that there is. The problem is that the workflows in scholarly publishing wind up putting a PDF out there as a deliverable, and all that knowledge about what the things are in the content, which is what accessible content needs, has been lost. So no, it's not expressed as HTML, but it's easy to transform from your very rich JATS markup into what would be acceptably accessible content. And one reason I use that term is that this is why the baseline concept is so important, is that it's just been devilishly hard for people to understand, well, how far do I have to go with this? What is enough to be considered sufficiently accessible? And there really isn't a good definition of that yet. So that's what this baseline initiative is designed to.
Yeah, I was less concerned about forward flow. But retro or archive content, particularly PDFs that were scanned and to different quality that you get there, it's almost impossible to make that stuff fully accessible.
It's very difficult. Although I will say that JSTOR, for example, Portico, normalize content into NLM JATS-based models. So the content, a lot of that legacy content is actually in good, rich markup. So there's a place to start. But no, it hasn't been put into a truly accessible form yet. But that wouldn't be hard to, your point is well taken. Those scanned PDFs are horrible to deal with.
Yeah, and
but
ours is a particular context where we're highly technical, heavy math, heavy tables.
Right.
I mean, things that don't play well with any of these systems. I mean, they don't really work well with all the modern tools that we have.
Right.
So, getting the retro content, legacy content into full accessibility is just a nightmare.
yeah. Well, one thing I did want to emphasize in this talk is that, I'm emphasizing how this convergence is accelerating and really significant. Doesn't mean that it's about to be finished. It's like we're just getting going on this process, right? So, and particularly on the accessibility side, there's a lot of content that could easily be made accessible, but then there's content like yours that's very challenging. But frankly, this community has embraced MathML for years, and that's what's needed for accessible math. Is it perfect? No, but it's infinitely better than not having MathML. I can give you an example. Initiative that Robin and I were involved in a couple of years ago involved people from the American Printing House for the Blind. One of the I was puzzled at the time. I was asked to kind of lead this initiative, and they kept putting a big emphasis on MathML. And I was thinking, well, isn't that, for general publishing, isn't that really an edge case? Isn't that, how many publishers care about math, right? And he said, I'll tell you why we care about this. When there's a physics textbook or a math textbook that a student needs, it can cost $50,000 and 6 months to make it accessible. But if the math was in MathML, it would be trivially easy to make it accessible. Huge. Just use MathML. Right. Now, that's one reason why I'm glad to see JATS doing what they're doing, because the browser community isn't embracing MathML. They're just sitting on their hands about it, right? So JATS is at least giving us a way to get our MathML and let it render. But by the way, as a byproduct of that, it's now accessible. And their MathML cloud is all about that. Todd.
Just for fun, in the last remaining minute, can you talk a little bit about the deprecation of XHTML in EPUB and what sort of impact that will have on publishers who have an XML workflow?
Yes.
And why that was, what's the rationale for that?
For what? For
The rationale for deprecating XHTML.
Well, first of all, it's not being deprecated. It's not being deprecated. There are those who would argue for that, but it was very clear when that was broached in an early draft of the spec that that would not happen. So if you'll look at it now, that's off the table. So the community basically spoke up and said, no, we need XHTML, we need XML. The proposal, and I think a likely outcome at some point, will be that either XHTML or HTML will be permissible as an EPUB. One reason for that is the reality is there are a ton of EPUBs out there in the wild that are actually just HTML now. So calling them not EPUBs is kind of bogus, right? But I, for one, absolutely am with you on it needs to be, for most publishers' workflows, you need XML because you need that discipline. Yeah. Well, we're over time, so I better shut up and let you get to your beer. Thank you, everybody.